Again, that's another very good question. And this is particularly important for me because much of my work really happens at the intersection between economics, public policy, and society. My entire career has been dedicated pretty much to translating academic research and theory into practice and policy, and resolving the inherent tensions that often exist in those domains. So I'm going to spend some time to really give some good account of my experience and observations here. Academic economics is largely about theory and methods. And when you think about this in terms of research dissemination, which is largely through journal publishing, then you end up seeing economists communicating only with their peers, with other economists across the board, pretty much on theoretical issues. Why? Because peer review and acceptance do matter. Those are two key things that matter. But then you have a non-technical audience, or let me say non-economist, who expect findings from economic research to be intuitive, things that make sense to citizens, to community leaders, political leaders, and society at large, without the need to amplify the models, the assumptions, the parameters, and stuff like that. I mean, it's like trying to convince folks about a two-country, two-commodity model in international trade. Like, seriously? They don't want those things. They just want to see those things in the appendix section of your paper, like we do in applied economic research. So that's a little tough. And in a way, this explains why economic engineering could be more popular. The second thing to talk about when you are looking at the distinction between academic economics and economic engineering is novelty. Novelty is a key goal in academic research. So before you get your work published in any decent journal, you must be introducing something new, some fresh perspective, something novel, which means that there's room for mistakes. Experimentation is good in economic science. And that explains why fields like experimental economics allows us to test theories under controlled conditions. We certainly cannot say the same for policymaking. Absolutely not. And you say why? Because policy mistakes are costly and they can occur very fast. And I think I have a good example here to corroborate that. Take, for instance, the COVID-19 pandemic. The debate on whether policymakers should use the so-called value of a statistical life, VSL, to set an upper bound on the pros and cons of regulations in order to save lives. That's a very important debate. So in academic research, it is simply the marginal rate of substitution between income, or say wealth, and the risk of mortality. You are just looking at the substitution between income and death. So you are asking people, how much are they willing to pay to reduce the risk of death? What we call willingness to pay, WTP. So think about the implications of that in a society where you have extreme income inequalities. Like, compare what that means for billionaires and folks at the bottom end of the income spectrum. You ask a billionaire and folks say who make less than $10,000 per annum, you ask them for their willingness to pay. You know that does have broad implications. And you also remember the value of a statistical life is used to determine the level of health, safety, environmental regulation, mention it. And you compare that to another measure, another metric called the value of quality adjusted life years to evaluate the cost effectiveness of clinical diagnostic procedures, surgeries, medications, and so on. You know, back in graduate school, I took a course in health economics. And I bet after a few hours in the library, completing assignments and all of that, my estimated value of a statistical life and the other metric, the quality adjusted life years, were great. Those were good estimates. But it's a different ballgame in reality, in the world of policymaking. So my point here is that the experimentation and the novelty in economic science, they are not luxuries that can be afforded in the realm of policymaking, because policy interventions oftentimes have long-lasting effects with major implications for intergenerational equity and justice. As I mentioned earlier, in general, policymaking is essentially about moving the economy towards a Pareto efficient state. And by implication, that means you have to bring many actors, stakeholders, and vested interest to a common ground. It is very important to achieve consensus. You have to consider trade-offs, which often mean compromises, consultations, polling, concessions, politicking, and what have you. All of those things are involved. In fact, that reminds me of David Baldwin in his book, Economic Statecraft. The book provides some great insights. Of course, the focus is on the failure of economic instruments in foreign policy, but he nicely offers a framework which blends economics, political science, philosophy, history, law, psychology and sociology to give a clearer picture on how economic engineering, it's a different ballgame compared to academic science. And this also explains the popularity of prospect theory, which is a strand of theory in behavioral economics. And it's very popular in policy circles because behavioral public policy allows us to examine moral and political philosophy. As you know, the gold standard of neoclassical economics is the assumption of rationality. So prospect theory was modified in 1992 by Kahneman and Tversky, as an alternative to the neoclassical doctrine of expected utility theory. And that was in a bid to help make sense of how decisions are made under risk and uncertainty, and why people tend to consistently deviate from the assumption of rationality. So it has since been shown that the framing effect is real, and some form of biases, heuristics, they are all hardwired into the human brain. And in the current environment also, you see that increasingly behavioral sciences are moving to the front burner of the toolkit when it comes to policy making because of their relative effectiveness in helping with policy designs when solving issues like poverty, retirement savings, pollution, addiction, obesity, and all of that. And a closely related work is the book called Notch, which was published in 2008 or 2009, thereabout. And you notice the rise in policy disciplines like environmental policy, consumer protection, and health policy, because those are insights that are really useful, when it comes to moving the needle, improving decisions about health, wellness, wealth, happiness. All of these things are a radical departure from the dominant neoclassical models, which are all centered around value creation, free markets, capitalism. So to design policies, it is important for policymakers to know how their constituents and subjects behave and why they behave in the way they do. Otherwise, such policies may not achieve their intended outcomes. So while academic economics has its place in terms of the heavy reliance on scientific evidence, economic engineering ensures that policymakers and political leaders do a much better job and fulfill their social contract by getting informed by the sciences of behavior. In closing, you also find that academic research often means that you pick a few specialties. So if you're an expert in, say, applied microeconomics, then pretty much you are using data and econometrics to test microeconomic theory. And then you are using data here to test theory in order to apply them to a wide variety of questions around individual and household behavior and societal outcomes. And that will cover areas like labor economics, industrial organization, public economics, health, urban economics, environmental economics, education, and all of that. So chances are you can't also be an expert in an area that does not, that is not complementary. When you think about the tools and data, theory and context, you can't be a jack of all trades. But when you compare that to policy making, it's a little different. Because in policy making, once you develop the toolkit, it can be used to answer a wide variety of questions in various areas. As Mankey puts it, when economists try to explain the world around them, we say they are scientists. But when it comes to improving the world, then they become policy advisors. So I'll stop there, but I really like the fact that this session, provides for a framework to look at the pros and cons of both disciplines. And I should also say that given what we have seen, in recent decades in terms of the pace of digitization and the advances in technological innovations, both fields or both segments continue to overlap, and it remains to be seen what happens, say, in the next 10 to 20 years with what we are seeing in tools and innovations.